The Aeroflot Tupolev Tu-154B crash on October 11, 1984, stands as one of the most devastating aviation disasters of that year, and indeed in Soviet aviation history. The aircraft, operating as Flight 3352 from Krasnodar to Omsk, with an intermediate stop in Novosibirsk, met with catastrophe during its final approach to Omsk airport in the early hours of that fateful Thursday morning. The Tu-154B, registration CCCP 85243, carried 170 passengers and 9 crew members when it collided with maintenance vehicles on the runway at Omsk airport, resulting in a catastrophic fire that claimed 174 lives and left only 5 survivors with severe injuries. This tragedy not only represented a horrific loss of life, but also exposed critical flaws in Soviet aviation practices and airport operations that would have far-reaching consequences for Aeroflot and civil aviation in the USSR. The flight had proceeded normally until the approach phase at Omsk. Weather conditions at the time of the accident were challenging, but within operational limits, with light rain and fog reducing visibility to approximately 800 meters. The aircraft was making a standard instrument approach to runway 25 when the disaster occurred at approximately 0:10 local time. What made this accident particularly shocking was that the Tu-154 struck 3 snowplow vehicles that were actively clearing the runway at the time of the aircraft's landing attempt. The collision occurred because the airport's ground control had failed to properly coordinate between air traffic control and ground maintenance crews, a fundamental breakdown in communication that would prove deadly. The impact sequence was violent and immediate. The aircraft's right wing struck the first snowplow, causing the fuel-laden wing to rupture and ignite. The main landing gear then collided with additional vehicles, tearing open the fuselage and allowing burning fuel to penetrate the passenger cabin. Eyewitnesses described seeing a massive fireball erupt as the crippled aircraft skidded down the runway, breaking apart as it went. The intensity of the fire was such that it completely consumed much of the aircraft's structure within minutes, making rescue efforts extremely difficult and contributing to the high fatality rate. The 5 survivors, all seated in the forward section of the aircraft, owed their lives to a combination of fortunate seating position and the quick actions of first responders who managed to extract them from the wreckage before the fire reached their location. These survivors suffered severe burns and other traumatic injuries, with some requiring extensive medical treatment and rehabilitation that lasted years. Their testimonies would later prove crucial in reconstructing the final moments of the flight and understanding the sequence of events that led to the disaster. Investigation into the crash revealed multiple systemic failures that contributed to the tragedy. The official Soviet inquiry determined that the primary cause was the presence of unauthorized vehicles on an active runway during landing operations. This fundamental violation of airport procedures was compounded by several other factors. Inadequate lighting on the snowplows made them difficult for the flight crew to see until it was too late. The airport's ground radar system was not operational at the time of the accident, and the air traffic controllers failed to properly monitor and control ground movements. Additionally, the investigation noted that the flight crew, while not primarily responsible for the accident, might have had limited visibility due to the weather conditions and did not execute a go-around when the runway situation was unclear. The aftermath of the Omsk disaster had significant repercussions for Soviet aviation. In the immediate wake of the accident, Aeroflot implemented new procedures for runway inspections and ground vehicle operations at all of its airports. The Soviet aviation authorities mandated improved lighting and marking for all airport service vehicles and instituted stricter protocols for coordination between air traffic control and ground operations. These changes, while implemented too late for the victims of Flight 3352, would help prevent similar accidents in the future. The human toll of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The flight manifest included passengers from across the Soviet Union, many traveling for family or work reasons. The high number of fatalities meant that entire families were sometimes wiped out in the crash, leaving communities in mourning across multiple republics. The Soviet government's initial handling of the disaster was typically opaque, with limited information released to the public in the immediate aftermath. This lack of transparency would later be criticized when fuller details of the accident emerged. From a technical standpoint, the Tu-154B involved in the accident was a relatively new aircraft at the time. Having entered service with Aeroflot in 1978, the investigation confirmed that the aircraft itself had no mechanical problems that contributed to the accident, and the Tu-154's safety record, while not perfect, was generally good for its era. This fact made the circumstances of the Omsk crash all the more tragic. The accident was entirely preventable with proper airport procedures and coordination. The crash site presented investigators with a challenging scene. The force of the impact and subsequent fire had destroyed much of the aircraft's structure, making it difficult to recover and analyze critical components. However, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were both recovered and provided valuable information about the aircraft's final moments. These recordings confirmed that the flight crew had followed proper procedures and were unaware of the vehicles on the runway until it was too late to avoid the collision. In the years following the accident, the Omsk disaster would be studied extensively by aviation safety experts as a prime example of the dangers of inadequate airport ground control. The accident highlighted the critical importance of strict separation between aircraft operations and ground vehicle movements, lessons that would be incorporated into international aviation safety standards. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, would later reference the Omsk accident in its guidelines for runway safety and ground operations. The psychological impact on the first responders who attended the scene was profound. Many reported lasting trauma from the horrific scene they encountered, with some leaving their jobs in emergency services as a result. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed local medical facilities, requiring assistance from neighboring regions to handle the casualties. This aspect of the response would later inform emergency planning for major accidents at regional airports throughout the Soviet Union. For Aeroflot, the accident came at a time when the Soviet flag carrier was attempting to improve its international reputation for safety. The Omsk disaster, coming just 3 years after another catastrophic Tu-154 crash at Norilsk in 1981, raised uncomfortable questions about operational standards within the airline and at Soviet airports. While Aeroflot would continue to operate the Tu-154 for decades after the Omsk crash, the accident marked the beginning of increased scrutiny of the airline's safety practices. The legal and compensation aspects of the disaster followed the standard Soviet practice of the era, with the government providing support to victims' families through state channels, rather than through the litigation processes common in Western countries. This approach, while providing some measure of support to those affected, left many families without the ability to seek independent accountability or additional compensation through legal means. From an engineering perspective, the crash provided valuable data about the behavior of the Tu-154 airframe in crash conditions. The pattern of structural failure and fire propagation informed improvements in aircraft design, particularly regarding fuel system integrity and cabin materials. While the Tu-154's basic design remained unchanged, subsequent safety modifications to the fleet incorporated lessons learned from the Omsk disaster and other accidents. The accident also had political ramifications within the Soviet aviation hierarchy. Several senior officials at Omsk Airport and within the regional Aeroflot administration were removed from their positions in the wake of the disaster. The shake-up extended to the national level, with increased oversight of regional aviation, operations and personnel training standards. These personnel changes reflected the Soviet system's approach to major accidents, where accountability was often assigned administratively rather than through public processes. Memorials to the victims were established in both Omsk and Krasnodar, though these were modest by Western standards in keeping with Soviet practices of the time. Annual remembrance ceremonies attracted survivors, family members, and aviation officials, keeping the memory of the disaster alive in local communities. These memorials would take on additional significance after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as they became focal points for reflection on the Soviet aviation era. The Omsk disaster's legacy in aviation safety persists to this day. The accident features prominently in training materials for air traffic controllers and airport ground personnel, serving as a stark reminder of what can happen when basic safety protocols are not followed. Modern runway incursion prevention systems, now standard at major airports worldwide, trace part of their development to lessons learned from this and similar accidents. For the Tu-154 program, the Omsk crash was one of several accidents in the early 1980s that temporarily affected the aircraft's reputation. However, the robust design and capabilities of the Tu-154 ensured its continued service for decades, with many examples flying into the 21st century. The aircraft's ultimate retirement from civilian service owed more to economic factors and noise regulations than to safety concerns stemming from accidents like Omsk. The historical context of the accident is also noteworthy. Coming during the final years of Leonid Brezhnev's leadership, the Omsk disaster reflected broader systemic issues within Soviet infrastructure and bureaucracy. The communication failures and procedural lapses that led to the accident mirrored similar problems in other sectors of the Soviet economy and government during this period of stagnation. In this sense, the tragedy can be viewed as symptomatic of larger challenges facing the USSR in its later years. Technological limitations of the era also played a role in the accident's circumstances. The lack of ground radar at Omsk Airport in 1984 would be unthinkable at a major Western airport of the time, highlighting the technological gap that had developed between Soviet and Western aviation infrastructure. This gap would only widen in the coming years, contributing to the gradual decline of the Soviet civil aviation sector. The human stories emerging from the disaster were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Accounts from survivors spoke of both terror and heroism in the aircraft's final moments. Ground personnel who witnessed the crash immediately rushed to help despite the obvious danger, saving lives through their quick actions. These personal narratives added depth to the official accident reports and reminded all who studied the disaster that behind the statistics were real people caught in unimaginable circumstances. In the broader history of aviation safety, the Omsk disaster occupies an important place as one of the last major accidents attributable primarily to ground control failures. Before technological solutions like advanced ground radar and runway incursion warning systems became widespread. The accident thus represents something of a turning point, coming at the end of an era when such accidents were more common and preceding the technological advances that would make them increasingly rare. The aircraft's flight path in its final moments has been extensively analyzed by investigators. Radar data showed that the approach was normal until the very end, with no indication of the impending disaster. The flight crew's last communications with air traffic control gave no hint that they were aware of any problem until the instant before impact, when the cockpit voice recorder captured exclamations of alarm as the vehicles became visible. Fuel loading for the flight had been normal, with adequate reserves for the planned route. The quantity of fuel on board contributed to the intensity of the post-crash fire, but was not a factor in the accident itself. This distinction was important in the investigation's conclusions, as it helped focus attention on the ground control issues rather than any aspect of the aircraft's operation or performance. The rescue and recovery operation lasted several days, as investigators painstakingly documented the wreckage and recovered human remains. The process was complicated by the extensive damage to the aircraft and the large number of victims. Forensic teams worked under difficult conditions to identify remains and provide closure to families, a process made more challenging by the Soviet system's limited experience with disasters of this magnitude. Medical analysis of the victims provided important data about survivability in such accidents. The pattern of injuries helped researchers understand the dynamics of the crash sequence and the effects of both impact forces and post-crash fires. This information would later contribute to improved aircraft cabin materials and designs aimed at enhancing survivability in similar accidents. The accident's timing, just after midnight, may have been a contributing factor, as nighttime operations often present additional challenges for ground visibility and crew alertness. However, investigators concluded that proper procedures should have prevented the accident regardless of the time of day, and thus did not consider the nighttime aspect a primary cause. Training records for both the flight crew and ground personnel showed no significant deficiencies that could explain the accident. The crew was experienced and properly qualified, while the ground vehicle operators had all received standard training. This finding reinforced the conclusion that the accident resulted from systemic rather than individual failures. The economic impact of the disaster was significant for Aeroflot, both in terms of the direct loss of a valuable aircraft and the broader effects on passenger confidence. While the Soviet system limited the airline's need to respond to market forces in the way Western airlines would, the accident nonetheless contributed to growing awareness within the Soviet aviation establishment of the need for improved safety standards. In the years since the accident, the site near Omsk airport where the crash occurred has changed significantly, with urban development encroaching on what was once open airport land. The physical traces of the disaster have long since been erased, but the memory persists in aviation safety circles and among those personally affected by the tragedy. The accident investigation report, when finally released in its entirety, provided a comprehensive analysis of the multiple failures that led to the disaster. While following the typical Soviet pattern of emphasizing systemic rather than individual responsibility, the report nonetheless contained valuable lessons that would influence Soviet aviation safety practices for years to come. Comparative analysis, with similar runway incursion accidents worldwide, showed that the Omsk disaster was unfortunately not unique in its basic causes. What made it stand out was the exceptionally high casualty count, resulting from the combination of a fully loaded aircraft striking multiple heavy vehicles at high speed. This tragic convergence of factors made the Omsk crash one of the most severe examples of its type in aviation history. The disaster's impact on aviation regulations extended beyond the Soviet Union. International aviation safety organizations studied the accident carefully, incorporating its lessons into global safety initiatives. While the Soviet system remained somewhat isolated from international aviation developments, the Omsk accident nonetheless contributed to worldwide awareness of runway safety issues. For the Tu-154 design team, the accident provided unexpected data about the aircraft's crashworthiness. While the collision forces were far beyond what any airliner could be expected to survive, the performance of certain structural elements in the crash informed minor design tweaks in later production models. These changes were incremental rather than revolutionary, as the basic Tu-154 design had already proven itself in years of service. The psychological impact on the Omsk aviation community was profound and long-lasting. Many personnel who had been on duty that night experienced lasting effects, with some leaving the aviation field altogether. The airport's operations were temporarily disrupted as staff dealt with the aftermath, and a palpable sense of shock permeated the facility for months afterward. In the context of Soviet aviation history, the Omsk disaster represents both a low point and a turning point. The tragic loss of life underscored the consequences of systemic weaknesses in Soviet aviation practices, while the reforms implemented in response helped pave the way for gradual improvements in safety standards. This dual legacy makes the accident a significant milestone in the evolution of Russian civil aviation. The accident's legal aftermath followed the typical Soviet pattern of administrative rather than judicial proceedings. Several officials received disciplinary sanctions and operational procedures were modified, but there was no public trial or detailed accountability process as might occur in other countries. This approach reflected the Soviet system's handling of similar major accidents during this period. Technological assessments conducted after the accident confirmed that the available technology of the time, if properly utilized, could have prevented the disaster. This sobering conclusion added to the tragedy's weight, as it demonstrated that the accident resulted not from unavoidable limitations, but from preventable human and organizational failures. The disaster's impact on Soviet aviation medicine was significant, as the medical response to such a large-scale accident tested the system's capabilities. Lessons learned from treating the survivors and handling the mass casualties influenced emergency medical preparations at Soviet airports and contributed to improved trauma response protocols. In the decades since the accident, aviation safety has made tremendous strides in preventing similar disasters. Modern runway incursion prevention systems, improved ground radar, enhanced lighting systems, and stricter operational protocols have dramatically reduced the likelihood of such accidents occurring today. The Omsk disaster stands as a somber reminder of why these advances were necessary and how much has been achieved since that dark night in 1984. The memory of Flight 3352 and its 174 victims endures as a powerful testament to the importance of vigilance, communication, and uncompromising safety standards in aviation. While the specific details of the Omsk disaster may fade with time, its essential lessons remain embedded in the procedures and technologies that keep air travel safe today. The tragedy thus represents both a profound failure and, in its aftermath, an important step forward in the ongoing effort to make commercial aviation as safe as humanly possible. The Omsk disaster reminds us that in aviation, the smallest procedural lapse can have the most catastrophic consequences, a lesson written in fire and blood that changed air safety forever.